I'm happy to see you all online, and I'm also very happy to introduce Dr. Pascal Badiou to you today. As I mentioned, I'm not participating today from University of Waterloo. I'm in Saskatoon at the final annual conference of the Global Water Futures Project. I just want to acknowledge that Saskatoon is located on Treaty 6 territory, and it's the homeland of the Métis, and I'm very happy to be here today with you. Before I start introducing the speaker of today, just a few comments on how this seminar works. We'll have a presentation of around 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Please enter your question in the Q&A box, not in the chat, but in the Q&A, and then we'll get to the questions at the end of the presentation. So as I mentioned, we have Pascal Badiou with us here today. He's been a research scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada's Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research for almost 20 years now, since 2006. And in general, his research focuses on the ecology of wetlands and large shallow lakes. In particular, he's interested in the role wetland restoration and conservation can play in regulating water quality and water quantity in agricultural watersheds of the Canadian prairies. And that's also going to be, to a large extent, the topic of his presentation today. He's also interested in how the interaction of multiple stressors, such as invasive species, increased nutrient loading, pesticides, and climate change affect wetland ecosystems. Specifically, Pascal has been conducting research to determine the importance of wetlands in carbon cycling, for example, and how these systems can be managed to mitigate against climate change. We actually, since recently, worked together in these new Canada Action and Climate Action and Awareness funded projects related to wetlands and peatlands. Pascal is also interested in the use of constructed wetlands for the management of stormwater and treatment of sewage effluent to improve water quality at the watershed scale within urban environments. And he's joining us today from the US. Pascal, we're very happy to have you with us here today, and I'm happy to hand over the floor to you.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really looking forward to sharing, some of the science that we've been doing for the last couple of decades related to wetland ecosystem services. And hopefully you're able to see my slide and hear me okay. So I'm going to focus mostly on looking at wetlands as nature-based solutions, with a focus on prairie wetlands, typically small, geographically isolated prairie wetlands. But Roy did allude to the fact that we are expanding this research to include many other agricultural regions outside of the Canadian prairies. So through the Climate Action Awareness Fund, we are going to be expanding our monitoring and research efforts to cover, for example, areas like the BC interior, southwestern Ontario, as well as Atlantic Canada. So I encourage those of you who are interested in learning about that work and maybe collaborating on some of those initiatives going forward to please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. So as I said, I'm going to focus on wetlands as nature-based solutions, specifically in the Canadian prairies. Again, my name is Pascal Badiou. I'm a research scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada's Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research. And as Roy stated, since about 2007, we have really shifted gears from what we had focused on historically as a research institute, which was obviously mostly waterfowl habitat and waterfowl conservation, to really start emphasizing the other values that wetlands provide society. Oh, sorry, 1 second here. The slides do not appear to be advancing now. Okay, are you seeing the next slide now?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. Looks like I'm going to have to right click to try and get those to advance. So as I was saying, we have historically focused on waterfowl habitat and waterfowl conservation. But, I think most people here realize that wetlands are really the Swiss Army knife of ecosystem services. And so while we have focused on the model on the left hand here, solely emphasizing the benefit of those habitats for waterfowl, we know that they provide society a whole host of other services, including water purification, flood and drought protection, carbon sequestration, as well as recreation opportunities. Now, when we're talking about these systems in the Canadian prairies, we can link them to some pretty significant ecological issues that we're currently facing. And so, for example, this is a map showing the Lake Winnipeg watershed. So that orange shaded area, roughly 1 million square kilometers, covering the most intensive agricultural zones, both in Canada and some of the intensive agricultural regions of the US, all running off into the world's 10th largest lake. And I'm not sure if everyone is aware of this, but I believe it was back in 2013 that Lake Winnipeg was actually proclaimed the sickest lake on the planet due to the severe, intense blue-green algal blooms that it was experiencing more frequently and to a greater extent. But what I found interesting as a research scientist working for Ducks Unlimited Canada is that our priority habitat area, outlined in red, the Prairie Pothole region, covers almost the entire western half of that watershed. And so there are very clear links between the conservation programs that we deliver on that landscape, as well as the ongoing impacts to wetlands on that landscape that are likely cropping up in Lake Winnipeg. So again, I'm focusing mostly on the role of these small, geographically isolated wetlands, and stepping back and thinking about scale is important because historically there has been fairly little research conducted on these systems, and I would say that there is no routine monitoring program to investigate the quality and functioning of these systems across the Canadian prairies, despite there being millions of these small basins on the landscape. And so because of that, again, due to their size, they're often overlooked in terms of their role with respect to watershed health. That's when we're looking at these on an individual wetland basis. But when you step back and look at these from a landscape level, you can see why they likely become quite important. So this is just a photograph I took from an airplane as I was flying from Winnipeg to Regina, demonstrating one of my favorite landscapes. But so you can see how the complement and the cumulative value of these small, geographically isolated wetlands adds up at a watershed scale. You can also likely realize that if you were an agricultural producer in this landscape, that this presents a significant challenge. With the size of equipment essentially getting larger, navigating around this type of landscape to apply inputs to your crop and monitor your crops or harvest your crops becomes substantially more challenging. So I thought I would give a little bit of context just on how this landscape was formed. I won't spend too much time on this. Most of you are likely familiar. But again, so I'm focused largely for this presentation on the Prairie Pothole region, where we have these numerous small geographically isolated wetlands. And these were formed essentially with the retreat of glaciers, 10 to 12,000 years ago. Where I'm calling from today in the US prairies, up to the Hudson Bay area was under about 2 kilometers of ice. And so as that glacier retreated and melted, it left these big chunks of ice behind that got embedded in the landscape. And as they melted, they formed depressions that eventually filled with water. So why are these small wetlands so special? So prairie wetlands are for the most part, non-floodplain wetlands, as I've mentioned, they're geographically isolated. So that means that they lack bidirectional hydrologic connections with adjacent streams or rivers. So often if you're standing beside a prairie wetland, there is no defined inlet or outlet. It essentially looks like a bathtub, just a depression on the landscape filled with emergent vegetation and water. And so again, these wetlands are often situated for the most part in working agricultural landscapes, so mostly occurring on private lands where land use change and drainage impact have impacts for wetland function. And these are particularly vulnerable to climate change because unlike completely terrestrial systems, whether that's grasslands or forests, prairie potholes can't migrate with a changing climate. They're fixed in space because they're restricted to those depressions. And as climate changes and water balances change, they will either disappear or perhaps grow in size. But they cannot migrate like other ecosystems. Now, if you recall the map I showed earlier of the Lake Winnipeg watershed, this is essentially just another version of that map. So now we're looking at the Lake Winnipeg watershed, but we're also factoring in non-contributing areas. So all of these areas shaded in red, historically, when this map was produced, starting back in the 1970s by the PFRA, roughly 50% of the watershed was deemed non-contributing area. And again, that overlays almost perfectly with the Prairie Pothole region. And so essentially you had all of these small isolated wetlands that were disconnecting large parts of the landscape from local streams and rivers. Now, before I talk a little bit about the images on this slide, actually, I'll just hop back for 1 second. So the reason why this is important is obviously because over the last 100 years or so, we have significantly changed the ratio of contributing area in this watershed. So by connecting up many of these small geographically isolated wetlands, we have really reduced the non-contributing area. And I'll come back to that a little later on in the presentation. But again, so this is important for Lake Winnipeg. As I mentioned, in 2013, it was recognized as the sickest lake in the world. And you can see the quality of water in the images on the left. And you know, this is popular cottage country, so obviously this has some serious economic implications for people living on this system, some significant potential health issues. And the image on the right here is essentially showing, you know, one of the larger algal blooms recorded on Lake Winnipeg. And so this is in excess of 10,000 square kilometers of algal bloom in the North Basin. And so when you can start seeing your algal blooms from space, you know, you have an issue. So again, realizing that there's this link between our priority landscapes, the Prairie Pothole region, the western half of Lake Winnipeg, again, where the vast majority of nutrients entering Lake Winnipeg come from. We're very interested in the trends with respect to land use change in that area. And so through our mapping using the Canadian Wetland Inventory, as well as doing change detection analysis, where we can look at historical wetland cover versus current wetland cover, we estimate that we've lost approximately 488,000 hectares of wetlands in the Canadian prairies over the last 40 to 60 years. And you can see that distribution over the various prairie provinces. So roughly 133,000 hectares in Alberta, 250,000 hectares in southern Saskatchewan, and 105,000 hectares in southwestern Manitoba. And just to give you an example of what this looks like, this is a parcel of land in the Smith Creek watershed in Saskatchewan in 1948. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this region, this is fairly close to the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, essentially somewhere between Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and Russell, Manitoba. So this is what that parcel of land looked like in 1948. If we jump ahead to a more recent snapshot in 1995, you can see that that parcel of land is almost unrecognizable, but I assure you that this is the same parcel of land. And so that is the type of landscape modification that has happened throughout many of the Canadian prairies. And again, this was often encouraged by local governments, right? As the prairies were being settled, we wanted to increase agricultural production. And so wetlands were often viewed as wastelands and were typically the first systems to be connected, drained, and converted to agricultural cropland. Now, as an organization, we've known for a long time that small wetlands are in fact likely the most important when it comes to waterfowl habitat. And so as I hop through this, unfortunately these animations are a little bit out of sequence, but so we can look at waterfowl production for one large 10-hectare wetland versus 10 1-hectare wetlands or 100 0.1 hectare wetlands. And what we see when we do this across the landscape is that the 100.1 hectare wetlands do much better at providing waterfowl habitat. And the reason for that is because when you have these small systems, it is really the periphery of these wetlands where the emergent vegetation occurs that is vital for habitat. And of course, if you have many small wetlands versus one large wetland, your perimeter to surface area ratio increases dramatically. Now, this is likely the exact same reason why these small wetlands do such a good job at processing nutrients. And so this is some work from Fred Cheng and Indita Basu out of University of Waterloo, who looked at numerous types of wetlands, small wetlands, and looked at nutrient processing rates, and had also showed, again, that these small systems are in fact hotspots for dealing with nutrients in the landscape. And again, likely related to this issue of perimeter to surface area ratio and having that vegetated area that really does the bulk of the heavy lifting when it comes to absorbing and retaining nutrients. Now, there's another factor that we've been able to dive into a little bit that might also explain why small wetlands are so efficient at removing nutrients and helping mitigate non-point source pollution. And that's because when we look at catchment area to wetland area using LIDAR for these small basins, we see that as wetland areas increase, that catchment area to wetland area decreases significantly. So these small wetlands are likely receiving and treating a larger proportion of the landscape relative to large wetlands. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes and slides focusing on some of the water quality work that we've done over the last number of years and just highlight some of the results from these various studies. So one of the things that we've really been interested in quantifying is what are the differences in water quality for wetlands embedded in conventional cropland versus those that are embedded in perennial cover pasture grassland landscapes. And so we've conducted a few studies now, and in fact, this is ongoing, but this is just a summary from some earlier research. Focused specifically here on total phosphorus, where we looked at a series of wetlands both in Manitoba and Saskatchewan embedded in these different landscapes, and saw significant differences, not surprisingly, for mean phosphorus concentrations, with those in cropland being roughly threefold higher than those in perennial systems, grass pasture. So that's for the mean concentrations. But looking at the median phosphorus concentrations, they're roughly 40-fold higher. So some pretty significant differences depending on how you look at these various wetlands where they're occurring in cropland and perennial systems. And this will become evident in the next few slides why this has important implications for other ecosystem services, for example, related to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just looking at water quality within intact wetlands embedded in the landscape. But one of the other things that we were able to do early on was to look at the impact of wetland drainage by actually studying the water coming out of drained wetlands. And as far as I know, I think this is still the only data set that has done this. And so when I first started at Ducks Unlimited Canada, we had initiated a study looking at a series of wetlands, essentially looking at 6 intact wetlands, 6 drained wetlands, and then monitoring discharge through those systems and looking at the water quality to essentially estimate nutrient export coefficients associated with those drained wetlands. And on the converse situation, looking at nutrient retention in intact wetlands, but I'm not going to be focusing on that here today. And so you can see the drained wetlands outlined in green here. So those were historically intact wetlands removed from the landscape using surface drainage, so you can actually see you can see the drainage channels associated with each one of those. And so we had monitored these. You can actually, if I flip back and forth between these, you can see the smaller wetland that is adjacent to the ditch on the upper left. That is in fact this system. And so what's interesting here is that you can see the footprint of where the wetland existed historically in the spring. And so the water is staying on the landscape here because that drainage ditch is essentially frozen. So there's essentially an ice dam. You can actually see our equipment on the horizon on the edge where we had a system equipped with an automatic water sampler, as well as continuous flow meters, looking at the discharge through that channel and collecting samples of water periodically so that we could assess the change in nutrient concentrations. So we were lucky to catch this because this probably only lasted on the landscape for a few days. So it's very easy to miss these situations. And of course, for the most part, spring snowmelt in the Canadian prairies only occurs over a fairly short period of time and generally corresponds with peak flows in many of the rivers and streams. So, I ran this calculation historically, but about 80% of the flow in prairie rivers occurs over a very short period of time, typically post-spring runoff. So as I said, as far as I know, we're still probably one of the only groups who have collected data on water quality coming through drained wetlands, at least in the Canadian prairies. And what we saw was fairly high phosphorus concentrations at the outlets of these drained wetlands. On average being 5 to 30 times the guideline for hypereutrophic systems. So they were fairly rich with respect to phosphorus. Also important to note that most of the phosphorus present in those samples is in dissolved form. And so that's really critical because a lot of the historical modeling and monitoring has been done in the US Midwest, where we're dealing with mostly erosional environments where a lot of the phosphorus is transported in particulate form and through sediments. Whereas in the Canadian prairies, because it is extremely flat, we don't really experience those erosional forces. Where it does occur, it's fairly isolated. And so again, most of the phosphorus in water flowing through these systems in the spring is in dissolved form, so more readily bioavailable to plants and algae downstream. And then we've also quantified that there's more bioavailable phosphorus in the sediments and soils associated with drained wetlands relative to those that are intact. Now, when we looked at the discharge through these drained wetlands and the water quality, we were able to come up with phosphorus export coefficients. And so so we did this both in 2008, 2009, looking at the average, it's about 1.7 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare per year coming through these drained wetland basins. If you look at the average phosphorus export for the entire Lake Winnipeg watershed, that's about 0.07 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare per year. Now, that's not a fair comparison because a large chunk of the Lake Winnipeg watershed is within, pristine boreal areas. But so a more appropriate comparison is likely looking at standard cropland phosphorus export coefficients. And so based on the work from Thiessen et al., conservation tillage, phosphorus export is usually around 0.65 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare per year, whereas conventionally tilled sites is usually around 0.4 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare per year. So you can see, that comparing the export from drained wetlands relative to cropland, we're likely experiencing anywhere from 3 to 4 times higher phosphorus export, at least based on this research for these particular sites. Now, as I said, we did look at comparing sediments and soils between drained and intact wetlands, where we ran batch equilibrium analyses to look at max phosphorus absorption as well as equilibrium phosphorus concentration. So the figure on the left here is looking at intact wetlands going from the upland on the bottom to the actual basin center on the upper curves. And so you can see that there's substantial differences in the Kmax, which is the maximum phosphorus absorption capacity of those sediments. So again, roughly 4-fold higher for intact wetlands relative to those of the drained wetland sites. So I'm going to shift away from water quality and talk now a little bit about water quantity. And of course, those two are, intimately linked. But we do know that there is a strong relationship between runoff ratios at the watershed scale and the amount of watershed that is considered to effectively contribute. So as your effective contributing area increases, runoff ratio typically increases as well. So runoff ratio is really just a measure of how easy a watershed can convert precipitation into actual stream flow. And so those ratios on the bottom are essentially indicating that, on the far left side at 0.25, that's essentially 25% of precipitation is resulting in stream flow that's measurable. And so again, as effective to gross drainage areas increase, we see increases in those runoff ratios. And we know that the loss of depressional storage is often responsible for increasing contributing area. And so this was an example of work from Schlottler et al., where they were trying to distinguish between the impacts of drainage of depressional areas, small wetlands, versus crop conversion versus climate in terms of water leaving the landscape. And they were able to show that, in fact, most of the change in water yield was related to the loss of these small depressional areas through surface drainage. So as the percentage of depressions lost increase as a percentage of the watershed area, you can see this corollary increase in the delta of water yield experienced in those watersheds. And so I believe this was for a series of 26 watersheds in Minnesota. And we essentially see the same thing occurring in the Canadian prairies. Now, this is a different metric and way of analyzing this. So on the left-hand side here, we are looking at the historical contributing area for the Broughton's Creek watershed in Manitoba, where we've done a lot of our water quality and monitoring work. And so those areas shaded in yellow are what we would have deemed to be historical effective contributing area. So that's based on historical land use and the full complement of wetlands that existed on the landscape in 1968. Now, if we jump ahead to 2005 and update that map by factoring in the wetlands that have been removed from the landscape, essentially increasing the drainage network, we see a substantial increase in effective contributing area. So roughly a 53.4% increase between 1968 and 2005. So a much greater proportion of that landscape now is yielding water to the outlet. And of course, that's bringing associated nutrients along with it. Now, I won't spend much time here, but we see the exact same thing for other watersheds where we have conducted this type of work. So this is for Smith Creek. This example is even more extreme. In fact, I should probably update this map because there is now essentially, so this was the historical boundary of the Smith Creek watershed. It has in fact been changed by drainage forces actually funneling adjacent watersheds through the northern portion of the Smith Creek watershed. So in fact, this watershed has grown over time because of additional drainage occurring along the boundaries. And of course, here we still do see a very large increase in the contributing area. So for historically, very little of the Smith Creek research basin was considered to be effective contributing area. And in fact, it almost never flowed during the summer. And we have seen substantial changes in that system over the last few decades. And so continuing on with this, with the Smith Creek watershed, we've partnered with John Pomeroy's group at the University of Saskatchewan to work on improving prairie hydrological models to better factor in the role of these small wetlands. And so again, this is just an example of the changes that we have seen in the Smith Creek watershed over time. So this is some of the work that was published by Holly Anand. And so on the top panel here, we're looking at the average discharges from the Smith Creek watershed between 1975 and 1994. Again, you can see that virtually all of the hydrograph, all of the flow occurs in the spring. And there's, virtually zero flow occurring during the summer months. We jumped to 1995, to the period to 2010, and we can see that there's been some significant increases, both in the maximum and mean discharge from that system. And now we're periodically seeing some flow events triggered by summer storms occurring later in June and July. And then if we look at some of the more recent data from between 2011 to 2014, we can see that those changes have progressed even further, where now we've actually experienced the peak discharge during a summer rain event, as opposed to those always being historically correlated to spring discharge events. So this system has been completely altered, and the hydrology has changed quite dramatically, with it becoming much more flashy and much more unpredictable as a result of the expansion of drainage throughout that watershed. So just looking at some of the results from Dr. Pomeroy's work, and again, these are, at least I find these fairly impressive, because historically a lot of people had just concluded, without doing any of this type of modeling work, that small wetlands likely played an insignificant role in more extreme flooding events. And the work conducted through Global Water Futures and John's group has I think flipped that on its head. So wetland drainage in the Smith Creek Basin had a strong impact on stream flow in flood conditions, with wetland drainage from 1958 to 2008 likely increasing the 2011 flood peak by 32% and the stream flow volume by 29%. And so again, important to note here that 2011 is the flood of record for that system as it stands currently. They also looked at scenarios of continued wetland drainage and concluded that those are going to have a very strong impact on stream flow in the future. And so, for example, for the flood of 2011, if we were to lose all the existing wetlands in Smith Creek, the peak likely would have increased by 78%. And again, the volume by 32%. So the model simulation exercise really shows that wetland drainage is increasing the contributing area of wetland-dominated prairie landscapes, and that this can increase annual and peak daily flows substantially. And again, this was, this is something that wasn't really considered historically. Again, a lot of engineers would have told you historically that there's no storage in small wetlands at the landscape level in extreme events. Now, of course, that can change with the event and antecedent conditions. If you were to experience back-to-back extreme flooding events, then perhaps these results would change. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you really can't separate water quantity impacts from water quality impacts. They are intimately linked. And so again, this is just some of the work that we were doing in Broughton's Creek, looking at water yields throughout the subwatersheds in Broughton's Creek in response to essentially drainage pressure. So on the x-axis here, as we move from left to right, the drainage intensity in those subwatersheds is increasing. And then we're looking at this over a number of years from 2009 to 2011. So again, 2011 for this watershed was also the flood of record or maximum discharge relative to 2010, which was relatively dry. But regardless of those event sizes, what we can see is that there is a fairly linear correlation between drainage intensity and additional water yield from these subwatersheds. And that's really important because when we start looking at phosphorus export across these systems, we also see that there is a linear relationship between water yield and phosphorus export. So as we're draining wetlands, we're increasing water yield. That greater water yield is also moving additional phosphorus. And so as a result of wetland drainage in these systems, we are increasing phosphorus export at the watershed scale. And so really, to sum this up, what we've been doing is taking areas that have acted historically as phosphorus sinks and converting those to critical source areas for phosphorus export. And so again, that obviously has serious implications for places where this is ongoing. And so, we're currently exploring, how wetland restoration could potentially mitigate some of the non-point source phosphorus pollution that is re-entering Lake Erie and leading to eutrophic conditions. And so there's a number of studies now exploring this throughout North to see if we could better target wetland restoration to handle non-point source phosphorus pollution. Now I'm going to spend the last little bit just talking about the role of these wetlands, small freshwater mineral wetlands, with respect to changing climate and how they can be used as nature-based solutions and some of the impacts that we're likely going to see going forward. So first of all, from a global perspective, important to note that these are, very productive ecosystems, with inland freshwater marshes having very high rates of net primary productivity, ranging anywhere from 250 sometimes to 3,000 grams of carbon per meter square per year. We also know that wetlands store a disproportionate amount of carbon globally, right? So even though they only occupy 5 to 8% of the landscape, they store roughly 30% of the soil organic carbon. Now, again, that is mostly with northern peatlands. So that's substantially different from the freshwater mineral wetlands that I'm talking about today. But again, just gives you some perspective that these systems, due to the biogeochemistry, the fact that they're wet, they have reduced rates of decomposition, but still highly productive, accumulate extensive amounts of organic matter and the organic carbon that goes along with it. Now, while wetlands are important global carbon stores, we know that they're also, very prominent sources of methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. But it's important to realize that how we manage and the perspective we take to these systems is quite important. So I would argue, and I think it's supported in the literature, that intact wetlands that have existed on the landscape for hundreds, if not thousands of years, are performing the same function, releasing the same greenhouse gases that they have historically. So they're not an anthropogenic source of greenhouse gases. And so as such, they're not really contributing to anthropogenic climate change. Now, how we manage those systems. So for example, if we are changing the water chemistry of those systems, and that is resulting in impacts to greenhouse gas emissions from those sites, then that would be an anthropogenic impact that we need to try and account for. And we will see some of this in the following slides. So one of the first projects I was involved with when I started at PU was this assessment of restored wetlands and intact wetlands with respect to greenhouse gas emissions and carbon stocks. And so we looked at a number of sites across the prairies, collected cores, measured greenhouse gas emissions using static chambers, and pulled together some of the first information looking at carbon stocks from these systems. And so again, not surprising, carbon stores were highest for intact wetlands and increased with restoration age. When we accounted for methane emissions at these sites, we were still predicting that they were likely sequestering about 3.25 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. But one of the most important factors I think that came out of this research is that it allowed us to estimate the change in soil organic carbon when we were draining and losing these systems. And so we estimated that about 89 tons of soil organic carbon per hectare is lost when you convert an intact wetland to cropland. And that's likely a fairly conservative estimate. But when you start factoring that into the amount of wetland loss that has been experienced across the Canadian prairies, it results, I believe the last calculation I did was that wetland drainage over the last 40 to 60 years has released likely about 158 million tons of carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. Now, we often talk about wetlands when we're thinking about climate change with respect to carbon stocks and greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also important to realize that these systems help buffer against the impacts of climate change through other mechanisms as well. So when we have intact wetland systems, they in fact help dissipate solar energy. And so there's been some work by Corney et al. To look at these systems, drained fields or dried crop fields that used to contain wetlands versus areas adjacent with still wetlands existing, and how that changes the energy flux, the kind of near surface to atmosphere interactions. And it can be quite significant. And so, the easiest way to explain this is, I'm sure most people here have experienced lake effect weather. So if you're standing beside a large body of water on a very hot, dry day, often it's a little cooler and more humid as a result of that body of water. Now, so that's difficult to measure for many small systems, but when you consider that the Prairie Pothole region has, in any given year, depending on how wet it is, between 5 to 8 million of these small basins, that impact can add up at the landscape level. And so when we start accounting for the role of wetlands in cooling and humidifying the atmosphere, some interesting trends come out. And so this is just an example of some earlier modeling work that was done. Now, again, this is mostly for the boreal, but the same things do apply for the Canadian prairies. When we look at the impacts of wetlands on climate, models generally find that they increase regional evapotranspiration, increase regional latent heat flux, decrease sensible heat flux, and that these on average actually produce cooler temperatures during the summer, 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. Now that may not sound like a lot, but it is very significant and could likely have significant implications for, for example, helping crops deal with heat stress. Now, we did run a very crude analysis when we first started thinking about this. and this has led to future modeling work that I'm not gonna speak about here today. But if you're interested in it, I would suggest that you look up some of the work by Lauren Bortolotti and Yan Ping Li out of University of Saskatchewan, who have done a deeper dive and larger modeling exercise on this. But again, this is just a very simple, crude analysis that we ran a few years ago when we started thinking about the role of wetlands in helping moderate climate, where I just wanted to take, the 64 climate stations that we had in the Prairie Pothole region of Canada, put a 50-kilometer buffer around those stations and looked at the wetland density across those stations relative to average temp and daily maximum temperatures. Now, we corrected all of that data for latitude and longitude, because obviously there are temperature differences as you move from east to west and north to south. And so even once we factored those in and accounted for those in the statistical model, we still saw this significant decrease in both daily average temperature and daily maximum temperature as wetland cover increased. So again, was confirming some of the stuff that we had seen in earlier models done mostly for the boreal region, that having increased wetland cover at the landscape was likely cooling and humidifying the atmosphere. Now, the last piece I want to finish off with is how this relates to some of the other systems that we deal with, in terms of constructed wetlands for dealing with stormwater management. And this is where the link between water quality and greenhouse gas emissions will likely become a little more clear. So if you're not familiar with the city of Winnipeg, Winnipeg has historically they had about 70 stormwater retention basins. I think we're probably upwards of about 100 now. Historically, they look like these conventional gravel pond, grass right up to the shoreline systems that were used for managing stormwater. And if you've visited any of these more recently, you would know that they have very extensive water quality issues. So most of these systems turn brilliant green about midsummer, look like pea soup, and are chocked full of blue-green algal blooms. And so there are some public health concerns for sometimes the birds that land and use these systems. I know there was some pelicans that had died a few years ago. Often you'll have pets around these systems. And then obviously the people living on these systems where they purchase their homes are not very pleased with the smell and odor coming from these stormwater retention basins. As a result, the consulting arm of Ducks Unlimited Canada over the last couple of decades has been implementing constructed urban wetlands for dealing with stormwater management. And so you can see that these systems look significantly different. They're full of emergent vegetation, include submerged vegetation benches, and are usually surrounded by a complement of native grasses too. And so this achieves a number of issues. So geese will still use these ponds, but geese like having a direct line of sight. So they no longer really migrate into people's yards and eat their grass and defecate all over the place. They usually stay on the pond because they do not like going through emergent vegetation if they cannot see what's on the other side. But what's really interesting is we compared. So again, historically, because there's water quality issues with many of those stormwater basins, and residents would complain, the city would come in and treat those. And so often there would be lots of submersed vegetation, and this is what was seen as unaesthetically pleasing, I suppose, by local residents. And so the city applied two different types of treatments. One, they would use a macrophyte harvester, essentially a big tractor system that would come and rip out all of the submersed vegetation. Or they would apply pesticides, a herbicide, an aquatic herbicide directly to the pond surface to kill off the vegetation. And so we ran a study to look at water quality across the conventional systems, non-treated and treated, relative to the newly deployed constructed wetlands. And so what we can see here on this figure is we're looking at chlorophyll A, so a metric of algal productivity, essentially a measure of blue-green algal blooms in this case, and looking at the treatment period, which is bracketed in those dotted lines. And you can see that the constructed wetlands had fairly low chlorophyll A concentrations throughout the open water season. You can see that the conventional untreated basins had significantly higher chlorophyll A, and those kind of increased linearly across the season. Obviously, we're not impacted by the treatment. Then you can see the conventional treated basins. So almost immediately after receiving those treatments, whether that was through harvesting the macrophytes or killing the macrophytes with an aquatic herbicide, that essentially resulted in massive blue-green algal blooms. And that's not surprising, because now, instead of having submersed vegetation competing for those nutrients, they were all readily available for algae growing in those systems. What was really interesting to us is that this had direct impacts to greenhouse gas emissions. So as chlorophyll A concentrations are increasing in these systems, we are seeing higher cumulative methane emissions. And again, that's not surprising as you experience these blue-green algal blooms. They decompose quickly, settle to the bottom. It's very labile organic matter, and so it rapidly gets converted into methane. And so again, just showing the links between water quality and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, again, this is for constructed and conventional stormwater basins, but these trends likely hold true for intact and restored systems as well, where water quality would have these implications. So that is really an overview of the work we've done over the last 2 decades with respect to nature-based solutions regarding these small prairie wetlands. And we're looking forward to really expand this work over the next few years into other agricultural regions of Canada. So with that, happy to take questions from the group. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pascal. That was an amazing overview of the different functions and functionalities of wetlands. We have a little bit of time for questions. There is one in the Q&A box already. Pascal, I'll read it out to you. It's from Angela Cameron. She thanks you for your work and states that it's so important what you've done and found in your research. In British Columbia, she says many of our wetlands are being rapidly eliminated and compensated for by creating stormwater ponds and increasing flow connections to fish habitat. How relevant do you think this research is for the province to consider when making decisions on how to allow wetlands to be infilled and compensated for? Should we be focusing on maintaining natural wetland hydrology instead of increasing service flow connection in all cases?
Yeah, so I likely can't speak directly to the circumstances in British Columbia, but I think following that mitigation sequence is always important. Where possible, we should be avoiding the conversion of wetlands, because it's much easier to lose carbon from these natural systems than it is to regain those functions with an offset. And I would argue that the same thing holds true for water quality. So that's not to say that there aren't potential engineering solutions, but I would argue that it's more cost effective to work with natural systems first and to avoid converting those and then implementing engineering solutions down the road, which often have higher capital costs and higher operating costs going forward. It's actually something that we deal with quite routinely. So DU historically used to focus on large engineered projects. We thought, great big wetlands were going to be great for waterfowl when we started, in the 1930s. And it was only through our science program over time that we realized, actually these large wetlands aren't super vital for waterfowl. Yes, they're important during migration and staging periods, but it's really these small wetlands during the breeding season that were important. But now what that means is that we have a bunch of legacy project with engineered features that we now have to figure out how to manage effectively going forward. So again, working with natural systems and avoiding their conversion would always be the first step. That's not always possible, but sometimes those mitigation sequences just get skipped, and we go directly to replacement as opposed to focusing on the avoided conversion first.
Thank you, Pascal. There is another question from Kim Sutherland, and she asks you, how difficult is it to restore small potholes or wetlands once they have been drained? It relates a little bit to what you just ended up saying, I guess.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So with prairie wetlands, you know, it is fairly easy to restore them. So we usually call these ditch plug wetlands. So if they were lost through surface drainage, often you can just implement a ditch plug, which restores the hydrology of the system. And then we historically just leave the natural seed bank do its thing. So often the cattail vegetation responds very quickly. In certain areas, it's bulrush. You know, so the hydrology is usually established fairly quickly and the vegetation returns. Now, do all of the wetland functions return instantly? No, I expect that there's likely a lag period for all of those processes to be reestablished. Obviously, you're going to accumulate organic matter not very quickly. That's going to be over the course of decades, not months. But the restoration is fairly simple. So that is the one saving grace for dealing with these small isolated systems in the prairie landscape.
Thank you, Pascal. We're getting close to closing, so thanks very much for your insights, Pascal. It's very crucial also for non-natural scientists like myself, economists who then also want to put a monetary value on these wetlands ecosystem services, and especially what I heard you say in reply to the first question. If we want to also compare the costs and the benefits of maintaining, protecting these existing wetlands versus what the costs and benefits are of restoring them or creating, recreating them. In order to be able to do this from an economic point of view, it's crucial for economists to have that information, the environmental impact assessment that you're working on, to justify the monetization of these wetlands ecosystem services. And we tend to forget sometimes, in my opinion, how important it is for economists to collaborate directly with scientists like yourself to fully understand and grasp what the implications are of protection versus restoration in terms of the ecosystem services that are being provided, and the quality of these ecosystem services, of course, is not just whether or not they're there, but actually the degree to which these functions are being delivered by existing or restored wetlands. So thanks very, very much. We have one more question from Ayar Sharma. I'm very sorry, Ajar, we have to leave. We're going to make a copy of the question, and Dr. Badiou has been kindly offering to answer questions that come up at the end that we cannot answer bilaterally. So you hopefully get a response from Dr. Badiou after this session. I want to thank Dr. Badiou once again very much for taking the time to prepare and present his work here with us today. I also want to thank the audience for participating. We had a great turnout today, and I invite you to be there again in less than a month's time on Wednesday, June 14th. We'll have Professor Sherry Longboat with us. She's a professor at the University of Guelph in rural planning and development, and she will be talking to us about how you bring different types of knowledges together to solve water problems, in particular indigenous knowledge compared with Western knowledge, I guess. So thanks all for participating. Thank you also to my colleague, Julie Grant, for producing this session, and I look forward to see you all again on the 14th of June. Thank you all, and stay well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.